What are the biggest lessons you take away from World War One? Maybe we talked about several, but you look back at the 20th century. As a historian, what do you learn about human nature, about human civilization, about history from looking at this war?
I think the lesson I would want everyone to take from the story of the First World War is that human life is not cheap. That all of the warring powers thought that just by throwing more men and more material at the front, they would solve their political problems with military force. And at the end of the day, in 1918, one side did win that, but it didn't actually solve any of those political problems.
And in the end, the regular people paid the price with their lives.
They did, and people who had been told that their lives were cheap remembered that, right? And it sort of reshapes mass politics for the rest of the 20th century, both in Europe and around the world.
Yeah, the cost of a death of a single soldier is not just, or a single civilian, is not just the cost of that single life. It's the resentment, that the anger, the hate that reverberates throughout. One of the things I saw in Ukraine is the birth of, at scale, of generational hate, not towards administrations or leaders, but towards entire peoples. And that hate, overnight, that hate is created, and it takes perhaps decades for that hate to dissipate.
It takes decades, and it takes collective effort to build institutions that divert that hate into other places.
One of the biggest things I thought was not part of the calculus, and when the United States invaded Afghanistan and Iraq, is the creation of hate. When you drop a bomb, even if it hits military targets, even if it kills soldiers, which in that case it didn't, there's a very large amount of civilians. What does that do to the how many years, minutes, hours, months, and years of hate do you create with a single bomb you drop? And calculate that, literally in the Pentagon have a chart. How many people will hate us? How many people does it take? Do some science here. How many people does it take when you have 1 million people that hate you? How many of them will become terrorists? How many of them will do something to the nation you love and care about, which is the United States, will do something that will be very costly? I feel like there was not a plot and a chart. It was more about short-term effects.
Yes, it's the idea of using military force to solve political problems, and I think there's a squandering of goodwill that people have around the world toward the United States. That's a respect for for its economy, for its consumer products, and so forth. And I think that's been lost. A lot of that.
Do you think leaders can stop war? I have perhaps a romantic notion, perhaps because I do these podcasts in person and so on, that leaders that get in a room together and can talk, they can stop war. That's the power of a leader, especially one with in an authoritarian regime, that they can, through camaraderie, alleviate some of the emotions associated with ego.
Yes, leaders can stop war if they get into the room when they understand from the masses in their countries that war is something that they want stopped.
So the people ultimately have a really big say.
They do, that it was mass movements by people in the United States for the nuclear freeze, in Russia pushing for openness, that brought, for example, Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev to Reykjavik to sort of debate, and eventually sort of put caps on nuclear weapons. Those two people made choices in the room that made that possible. But they were both being pushed and knew they were being pushed by their people.
Boy, that's a tough one. It puts a lot of responsibility on the German people, for example, in both wars. We fans of history tend to conceive of history as a meeting of leaders. We think of Chamberlain, we think of Churchill, and the importance of them in the Second World War. I think about Hitler and Stalin, and think that if certain conversations happened, the war could have been avoided. You tell the story of how many times Hitler and Nazi Germany's military might was not sufficient. They could have been easily stopped. And the pacifists, the people who believed Hitler, were foolish enough to believe Hitler, didn't act properly. And if the leaders just woke up to that idea, and in fact, Churchill is a kind of representation of that. But in your conception here, it's possible that Churchill was also a representation of the British people, even though seemingly unpopular. That force was they gave birth to somebody like Churchill, who said, "We'll never surrender." Right?
Yes,
she'll fight in the beaches.
Yes, and I think World War II Britain is a good example of that. It is clearly a dynamic leader who has his pulse on what the people want and demand and are willing to do. And it's a dynamic art of leading that and shaping those wants at the same time as knowing that you're bound by them.